Well, yet another day, yet another victory lap for the Prime Minister before he goes overseas yet again. This time the victory lap was in Western Australia to say high five to all the people that they got elected and to remind the people of Western Australia this is the way it should be forever. But there's also somebody who's been taking a victory lap in the past few days that I also want to focus in on. Jason Clare. Now, Jason Clare is the new Education Minister, and he is the perfect example of a very common story from Western Sydney about a local boy come good, somebody who was able to achieve more in his life in terms of education than anyone else in his family. Again, I know the feeling to be the first person in your family to go to university, the first person in your family to do this, that and the other, but he uses that to say the importance of education is why it's his dream job to be the Education Minister of the country.
I'm the first person in my family to go to uni. I'm the first person in the family to finish high school. I'm the first person in the family to finish year 10.
But the thing is that he is the product of a school system from not the 2020s or the 2010s or the 2000s. He is a product of a school system as a kid who was born in the 1970s, of the 1980s and 1990s. Now, you and I would both know that that's a very different school system than the one that we have today. One where the curriculum was very clear, where we weren't being taught all day, every day, everything that had to do other than the basics. I remember that when I went to school, the biggest debate about what was happening inside schools was whether or not to continue with foundation writing. But now we have foundational conversations about biology, about sex, and about gender. We have foundational conversations about what version of history is the one that's either most honest or most activist. We have a school system that is going backwards and has been for a very long time. And now it's what he inherits. As they told us today in the Australian Financial Review, that the school system in Australia that he inherits is going backwards. Falling school standards, of course, have been a focus for many for a long period of time. Way back when Julia Gillard was the Education Minister, more than a decade ago, the solution was to spend billions of dollars on, among other things, new school halls, and everything would be magically okay. Well, of course, it didn't. We kept going backwards. We have consistently been going backwards since the turn of the century and even a little bit before that. Yet, amazingly, the new Education Minister, who cites his own experience of being able to be lifted up by education of the 80s and 90s, that what is taught in our schools today is apparently no longer a discussion. Put simply, he thinks that any arguments about the curriculum have now been settled. That because the federal election went the way that it did and because the majority of states are Labor or lefty Liberal states, then somehow the way we run our education system is perfect. Now, again, if the solution of this Education Minister is going to be the same as the last one, the one before that, 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 and the one before that, which is that you don't have to change what's being taught, you just have to change the air conditioning status of the rooms of which it is being taught in, then our kids will continue to go backwards. And while I'm sure that those who would like our school education system to simply be a factory for future activists and lefties don't really care about the academic standards that come out of our schools, parents and grandparents absolutely believe that our school system has lost its way. Now, I say this as a kid who did incredibly poorly at school. As I've said many times before, in terms of book smarts, I am as smart as a brick. I got 42 in my HSC, which way back then still meant less than 50, which means a fail. The only way I was able to get to university was because my now dearly departed but still equally wonderful and forever alive in our hearts mother-in-law, who was a teacher, wrote a plea letter to the University of Western Sydney, and it was only after all of the other spots were taken up by all of the other kids that eventually I got a chance to do arts. Now, I get it, yes, it was a bit wanky, it was a bit postmodern, it was a bit gender studies, but still it was at least a time in university where to build an argument was in part what you were being taught, not about whether the argument was entirely correct or not. That opportunity led to the person who sits here opposite you today. So the parts that I like about Jason Clare is that he understands the power of education and how transformative it can be. It's no longer little white kids in Western Sydney that have that experience, but kids from all over the country who should have that experience. But they should have the education system and standards and focus of the 1980s and 90s, which even when I was going through it, were too lefty for my parents then. But I can tell you as a parent now, with my girl going into year 3 next year, it is a very different education system than the one that I went through or her grandparents went through. This is the fundamental fight for our country. What we teach in our schools, it's something that must be confronted. Yet it feels like we are powerless to be able to push back. And if you do push back, then somehow you're on some sort of white pride obsession, or you're somebody who doesn't want our kids to be the modern little people that exists today. Well, of course, that's not true. All of us understand that it can't be 1985 forever. It can't be 1986 forever. It can't be 1962 forever. But in 2025, when the Education Minister says that the curriculum wars are over, when that curriculum in and of itself is part of the reason why our standards are going backwards and generations of kids suffer, then we are weakening our country before it even begins.